The most dangerous woman in a boardroom is not the one raising her voice, but the one who has already signed the papers. Ethan Whitman had built his entire life around rooms like this. Rooms with glass walls, polished walnut tables, silent assistants, and men in dark suits waiting for him to speak, as if his words could still move markets. On that gray Tuesday morning in Manhattan, 47 floors above Madison Avenue, he walked into the executive conference room of Whitman & Company with the practiced posture of a man who had spent years mistaking attention for power. His navy suit was tailored, his shoes were polished, his silver watch caught the cold light from the windows, but none of it could hide the exhaustion gathered beneath his eyes or the slight tremor in the hand that adjusted his cuff. Outside, rain dragged silver lines down the glass, blurring the city into a watercolor of headlights and steel. Inside, nobody stood to greet him. That was the first warning. The second was the silence. The board members sat along both sides of the table, faces closed, folders aligned in front of them like sealed verdicts. His chief financial officer stared down at a legal pad. The bank representative did not remove her glasses. The company attorney, a narrow man named Harold Green who had once laughed too loudly at Ethan's jokes, now looked at him with the careful pity people reserve for men who have not yet realized the funeral is their own. Ethan forced a smile anyway, because pride, like cheap perfume, tends to linger long after everyone wishes it would leave. "Let's make this quick," he said, dropping into the chair at the head of the table, the chair that had once made him feel untouchable. "I have a restructuring call at noon." No one answered. At the far end of the room, Harold opened a black leather folder and slid a document forward with both hands. The gesture was almost ceremonial. Ethan glanced at the title page, saw the words acquisition agreement, and allowed himself one thin breath of relief. For 3 months, Whitman & Company had been bleeding quietly. 2 major clients had walked away. Lender in Chicago had called in a note Ethan had been certain they would roll over. The press had started using words like instability and leadership concerns, words that sounded polite until they began eating through stock value. But Ethan had survived storms before. He had charm. He had history. He had a name on the building. Names mattered, he believed. Names opened doors. Names made people forgive debt, delay consequences, and pretend weak men were visionaries for one more quarter. "So," he said, tapping the folder with 2 fingers, "who is our white knight?" Harold's jaw tightened. "The buyer has requested one condition before final execution." Ethan leaned back. "Naturally. She wants to be present." A faint irritation crossed Ethan's face. "She?" Before Harold could respond, the conference room door opened. Every head turned. Claire walked in without hurry, without jewelry loud enough to announce her, without the dramatic smile Ethan would have expected from someone arriving to witness his humiliation. She wore an ivory suit, simple and exact, her dark blonde hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, a black portfolio tucked beneath one arm. She looked older than the woman he had left behind, but not diminished. Sharpened, like grief had taken everything soft from her and returned only what could survive pressure. For one suspended second, Ethan did not understand what he was seeing. His mind reached for explanations and found only fragments. Claire in their first apartment, Claire correcting his pitch deck at 2 in the morning, Claire standing alone outside the courthouse after the divorce, Claire disappearing from his life with the quiet obedience he had mistaken for defeat. She stopped beside the empty chair opposite him, placed her portfolio on the table, and looked directly at him. Not angry, not wounded, not even pleased. Calm was worse. Calm meant she had already lived through the scene that was just beginning for him. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. The man who had once boasted at every gala that Whitman & Company was the empire he built from nothing now stared at the woman he had written out of the story. Harold cleared his throat, and the sound seemed to crack the room in 2. "Mr. Whitman," he said softly, "the acquiring entity is Morgan Crest Holdings." Claire removed a pen from her portfolio. Ethan's eyes dropped to the signature line, then to the printed name beneath it. Claire Morgan. Her maiden name. The one he had told her sounded too ordinary for the life he intended to build. The rain kept sliding down the windows. The city kept moving below them. But inside that room, Ethan Whitman finally understood that the company he had spent years boasting about was no longer waiting for him to save it. It was waiting for Claire to sign. Claire did not sit down at first. She remained standing behind the chair opposite Ethan, one hand resting lightly on the back of it, as if the room belonged to no one until she decided what to do with it. The board members watched her with the strange stillness of people who had already chosen their side, but were waiting for the final signature to make it respectable. Ethan stared at her across the length of polished walnut, and for a moment the years between them folded inward. He saw the woman she had been when Whitman and Company was not yet a company, but a rented office above a dry cleaner in Hoboken, with buzzing fluorescent lights, one second-hand printer, and a coffee machine that burned everything it touched. Back then, Claire had worked a full day at an accounting firm in Midtown, crossed the Hudson after 6 in the evening, and sat beside him until past midnight, turning his scattered ambition into something investors could understand. She had rewritten his first business plan, built the early financial models, cleaned up the payroll mistakes, and memorized the names of clients Ethan forgot 2 minutes after shaking their hands. He had called it support. She had believed it was partnership. That was the first lie that hurt her, because it was the one she told herself. In those early years, Ethan used to kiss the top of her head when a pitch went well and whisper, "We did it." Then the checks became larger, the offices moved higher, the suits became sharper, and somehow the word "we" vanished from his vocabulary like it had never belonged there. At galas, he introduced her as his wife with a soft laugh, as if she were a pleasant detail attached to the real story. When clients praised the company's strategy, Ethan accepted the compliments alone. When investors admired the discipline in the numbers, he smiled as if discipline had ever been one of his virtues. Claire stood beside him in silk dresses she had not chosen, holding champagne she barely drank, listening to him tell strangers how he had built Whitman and Company from nothing. Nothing, apparently, included her nights, her savings, her quiet warnings, and every part of herself she had put on hold so his dream could breathe. Vanessa Pierce arrived during the company's 5th year, bright, polished, and ambitious in the loud way Ethan had come to admire. She understood cameras, headlines, and the delicate art of making a weak decision look visionary for exactly long enough to survive a press cycle. Ethan brought her into meetings Claire used to attend, then stopped inviting Claire altogether. Hold the things a person cannot afford to waste yet. Someone who no longer needed him to understand her pain in order for it to be real. Harold Green began reading the final terms, his voice steady but low. Morgan Crest Holdings would assume the secured debt. The outstanding lender claims would be consolidated. The remaining viable divisions of Whitman and Company would be preserved under new management. Ethan Whitman would resign immediately from all executive authority, though a transitional advisory role would remain available for 30 days at the buyer's discretion. At the buyer's discretion. The phrase landed with a quiet finality that no insult could have matched. Ethan looked down the table, searching for one loyal face, one person willing to interrupt the machinery now moving without him. His chief financial officer would not meet his eyes. 2 board members studied their folders. The bank representative folded her hands and waited. They had all come dressed for a rescue. Only Ethan had failed to understand that the person being rescued was not him. It was the company from him. "Claire," he said at last, and her name sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, stripped of ownership. She looked up. The room seemed to hold its breath for him, as if even the rain against the windows had softened to hear what he would do with his last chance to be decent. "Why did you not say anything?" he asked. It was not the question he meant to ask. He meant, "How did you do this?" He meant, "Who helped you?" He meant, "How could the woman I dismissed become the person I now need permission from?" But pride translated all of that into a smaller sentence. Claire studied him for a moment. She could have reminded him of the nights above the dry cleaner, when she had built the first cash flow projections while he practiced his investor smile in the reflection of a dark window. She could have mentioned the courthouse, the lawyers, the cold little settlement designed not to make her whole, but to make her quiet. She could have spoken of Vanessa, of the parties, of the way Ethan had stood in rooms filled with people and erased her with charm. She did none of that. She uncapped the pen. "Because I learned something from you," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. Ownership speaks louder than speeches. Then she signed. Not quickly, not dramatically, just once, in a clear hand, on the line that transferred control of Ethan's proudest possession to the woman he had mistaken for a footnote. No one applauded. No one gasped. The room did not need theatrics. The sound of the pen moving across paper was enough. Ethan stared at the signature as if it might rearrange itself into a mistake. Claire Morgan. Not Whitman. Never again Whitman. Harold collected the documents and passed them to the bank representative, who added her signature with the efficiency of someone closing a file that had stayed open too long. One by one, the papers moved around the table, and with every name added, the empire Ethan had polished for years became less his. When the last signature was complete, Claire closed her portfolio and finally leaned back. The employees will be told by noon, she said. Their health benefits and payroll are protected. The Denver office will be closed in phases, not overnight. The client teams will stay intact where possible. I am not here to punish people who did their jobs. The words exposed him more completely than any accusation could have. Ethan had spent years calling himself a builder, but the woman he had left behind was the one speaking like a steward. And me? He asked, the question barely above a whisper. Claire looked at him then, fully, and for the first time all morning he saw no hatred in her face. That frightened him more than hatred would have. Hatred meant a door was still open somewhere. This was something colder and cleaner. Completion. You will receive the agreement your attorneys negotiated, she said. Nothing less. Nothing more. It was fair. That was the cruelty of it. Ethan had prepared himself for vengeance, but he had no defense against fairness. By 11:30, the company email had gone out. By noon, the lobby screens no longer displayed Ethan's face beside the words founder and chief executive officer. By 3 in the afternoon, the temporary signage at the front desk read Morgan Crest Holdings in modest silver letters. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the sidewalks slick and bright under a thin wash of winter sun. Ethan stood on Madison Avenue without an umbrella, looking up at the building that had once carried his name like a crown. Claire came through the revolving doors a few minutes later, speaking quietly to Daniel Mercer on her phone. She paused only long enough to end the call. For a second, they faced each other on the sidewalk, surrounded by taxis, wet pavement, and strangers who had no idea that a whole marriage had just finished dying upstairs. Ethan seemed smaller outside the conference room, smaller without the table, the title, the waiting audience. Claire, he said again. This time there was no command in it. She held his gaze, not unkindly. Take care of yourself, Ethan. Then she walked past him toward a waiting black car, her steps steady, her expression unreadable. She did not turn around. She did not need to. The victory was not in watching him break. It was in knowing that his rise, his fall, his regret, and his silence no longer had the power to decide the shape of her life. For the first week after the acquisition, Claire arrived before sunrise and left after the cleaning crew had already begun their quiet evening circuit through the halls. There was no dramatic celebration, no champagne placed on ice, no triumphant announcement staged for cameras. Human beings, for reasons history has never successfully defended, often confuse noise with importance. But Claire had learned that the most serious changes usually began with locked conference rooms, revised spreadsheets, and people brave enough to tell the truth in plain English. The old executive floor still smelled faintly of Ethan's cologne and expensive leather, as if the building itself had not yet accepted that its favorite illusion had moved out. His portrait had been removed from the lobby by Friday morning, not thrown away, simply placed in storage with the same professional discretion used for outdated furniture. Claire did not watch it happen. She was upstairs with department heads, asking questions no one had been allowed to answer honestly for years. Which clients were still salvageable? Which contracts had been promised beyond capacity? Which employees had worn leadership and been ignored? At first, people spoke carefully around her, measuring every sentence as if Ethan might still appear from behind the glass walls with that charming smile and a punishment disguised as feedback. Claire understood their fear. She had once lived inside the same weather system. So she did not demand loyalty. She gave them something rarer. She gave them room to be accurate. By Wednesday afternoon, a senior project manager named Ruth Callahan slid a folder across the table with trembling fingers and admitted that the Denver expansion had been doomed 6 months before the first office lease was signed. By Thursday, the client services director explained how Ethan had forced teams to overpromise delivery timelines to impress investors. By Friday, a junior analyst sent Claire an email at 2:17 in the morning with a subject line that read, "I think this matters," and attached a spreadsheet showing how vendor payments had been delayed to make quarterly cash flow look stronger. Claire read it twice in her apartment overlooking the Hudson, while the city glittered beyond the windows and her tea went cold beside her laptop. She remembered doing the same thing years ago, finding the flaw no one wanted named, carrying the truth into rooms where Ethan preferred applause. The difference now was simple. This time, the truth had somewhere to go. Ethan, meanwhile, had discovered that losing a title was not an event but an erosion. For the first few days, people still returned his calls out of habit. Then they answered by email. Then his messages went to assistants. His transitional advisory role sounded dignified in legal language, but in practice it meant a temporary office on the 23rd floor, a badge that no longer opened the executive elevator, and a calendar filled with meetings that kept getting moved. Vanessa Pierce resigned before the first full staff meeting, citing personal brand alignment and future opportunities, which was a graceful way of saying she had no interest in standing beside a man whose spotlight had gone out. Ethan read her statement online before she sent it to him personally. The small cruelty of that almost made him laugh. Almost. On the following Monday, Claire held the company-wide meeting in the main auditorium. More than 300 employees filled the seats, with another 200 joining from offices in Boston, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. Ethan watched from the back row, uninvited but not forbidden, because Claire had no reason to hide from him. She stepped onto the stage without music, without a slogan glowing behind her, wearing a charcoal suit and holding a few note cards she never looked at. "This company has been asked to perform strength while carrying fear," she said. Her voice carried evenly through the room. "That ends now. We will not save every division. We will not pretend every decision made before today was wise. But we will protect the work that still has value, and we will protect the people who made that value possible." No one cheered at first. They were too startled by the absence of performance. Then, from somewhere near the middle rows, someone began to clap. Others joined, cautious, then firmer, until the sound filled the auditorium not like worship, but like relief. Ethan felt it move through the room and understood, with a humiliation so quiet it almost passed for grief, that they were not applauding because Claire had taken his place. They were applauding because she had removed the need to pretend. After the meeting, he found her near the side exit, speaking with Ruth Callahan. He waited until Ruth left, then stepped forward. "They trust you quickly," he said. Claire looked at him for a moment, then toward the auditorium where employees were still gathering in small, murmuring groups. "No," she said. "They are just tired of being managed by someone who needed to be admired more than he needed to listen." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Ethan looked away first. For the first time, Claire felt no satisfaction in his silence. Only distance. The kind that meant she had finally crossed a bridge and had no intention of checking whether he was still standing on the other side. By the end of the second week, the building had begun to change in ways too small for headlines, but too meaningful for the people inside to miss. The executive elevator no longer stopped only for a handful of names typed into a private access list. The corner conference room, once reserved for Ethan and visiting investors who liked skyline views more than honest numbers, was open for project teams that actually needed the space. The old reception wall, where Whitman and Company had once gleamed in oversized brass letters, was covered with a temporary matte panel while the new signage was being fabricated. Employees passed it every morning with the cautious curiosity of people watching a storm clear but not yet trusting the weather. Claire noticed everything. She noticed who spoke only when invited. She noticed who apologized before offering useful information. She noticed how often the women in operations said, "This may be nothing," before presenting the exact detail that explained everything. Human beings had apparently invented entire office cultures around making the most competent people doubt themselves. Claire found that both tragic and wildly inefficient. So she changed the meetings first. No more performances disguised as updates. No more three-layered praise before one sentence of concern. No more punishing people for bringing bad news early. Bad news ages badly, she told the leadership team on a cold Thursday morning. Bring it while it can still be useful. Ruth Callahan wrote that down. So did 3 other managers. Ethan would have laughed at a line like that, then repeated it later at a luncheon as if it had been his. Claire let the memory pass without touching it. That was becoming easier. Not easy exactly. The past did not disappear because paperwork changed hands. It lingered in odd corners. In the smell of the boardroom polish. In the view from the 47th floor. In the way her reflection in the glass sometimes overlapped with the younger woman she had been. The one who waited for Ethan to look up from his phone and remember she was in the room. But memory had lost its authority. It could visit. It could not govern. On Friday afternoon, Daniel Mercer came by her office with 2 coffees from the cart downstairs because he claimed the company machine produced something legally adjacent to regret. He stood near the window while Claire reviewed the revised restructuring plan. "You are moving faster than I expected," he said. "The company was rotting in predictable places," Claire replied. "Predictable rot is still expensive rot." Daniel smiled faintly. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, blunt, and allergic to theatrics. That was one reason Claire trusted him. Years earlier, when every interview had felt like a polite test of whether Ethan had been right about her, Daniel had been the first man in finance who did not treat her silence as emptiness. He had handed her a distressed retail portfolio and told her to find the lie in the numbers. She found 7. He hired her before lunch. Now he looked around the office Ethan had once occupied, where Claire had removed the leather sofa, the framed magazine covers, and the ridiculous sculpture that looked like ambition having a dental emergency. In their place were 2 simple chairs, a long work table, and a wall covered with operating maps. "You know," Daniel said, "some people expected you to gut this place just to make a point." Claire did not look up. "Then some people still think revenge is strategy. And it is not. It is a sugar rush," she said. "Satisfying for a minute. Destructive if you build a diet around it." Daniel gave a quiet laugh. "That almost sounds healthy. Terrible development." Claire signed the approval memo and set it aside. Down on Madison Avenue, traffic moved through the late afternoon in streams of yellow cabs and black cars, each person convinced they were urgently important in the grand comedy of American scheduling. For the first time since the acquisition, Claire allowed herself to feel tired. Not weak, not uncertain, just tired in the honest way people become after carrying something heavy for a long distance and finally setting it down. That evening, she stayed after everyone left. Understated, almost severe. Her name did not shout from the wall. It did not need to. When the final letter was secured, the lobby lights caught the sign and made it glow softly against the stone. Claire looked at it for a long moment, and the ache that rose in her chest surprised her. It was not triumph. It was recognition, not of what Ethan had lost, but of what she had recovered. Her work, her judgment, her name. Behind her, the revolving doors turned, and for one foolish second she thought of the old days, of Ethan arriving late with apologies that sounded beautiful and meant nothing. But it was only Ruth Callahan coming back for a forgotten laptop. Ruth stopped when she saw the sign, then looked at Claire. "It suits the place," she said. Claire smiled, small but real. "Not yet," she answered. "But it will." The next morning, Claire found a cardboard box outside her office door with no return label, no note, and no attempt at elegance. For one strange second, she thought it might be some forgotten vendor shipment or another relic from Ethan's reign that facilities had decided belonged to her, because humans apparently saw a woman in charge and immediately began offering her stray objects. Then she saw the handwriting on the side. Ethan's. Not the smooth signature he used on contracts, but the sharper, hurried script she remembered from old grocery lists and hotel stationery, from the years before every mark he made had become performance. Her assistant, Marissa, stood a few feet away holding 2 folders against her chest. "Security brought it up from the lobby," she said. "They scanned it. It is just papers and a few office items." Claire nodded, though something low in her stomach had already tightened. "Thank you. Leave it here." Marissa hesitated just long enough to prove she had good instincts, then walked away. Claire carried the box inside and closed the door. The morning light had not yet warmed the office. Madison Avenue moved below in its usual impatient rhythm, delivery trucks double-parked, pedestrians dodging puddles, yellow cabs sounding their horns as if noise could solve traffic, which explained a great deal about civilization. Claire set the box on the work table and opened it. On top was Ethan's old brass desk nameplate from the first real office, the one in Midtown before the company became glossy enough to require a public relations department. Ethan Whitman, founder. Beneath it were framed photographs she had not seen in years. A ribbon-cutting ceremony. A charity breakfast. A blurry snapshot from the Hoboken office, taken late at night, with Ethan grinning beside a whiteboard covered in numbers. Claire was in the corner of that photo, half turned away from the camera, holding a marker and laughing at something outside the frame. She had forgotten that version of herself could laugh with her whole face. Under the photographs lay a thick folder secured with a rubber band. Claire opened it carefully. Inside were copies of early operating plans, investor decks, handwritten notes, and drafts of documents she had built from scratch before anyone knew the company existed. Some pages had her comments in blue ink. Others had Ethan's old revisions, impatient and messy. Near the bottom was a small envelope addressed to her. For a long moment, she did not touch it. She had learned not to open every door the past left unlocked. But this one sat in her office, on her table, in a company now operating under her authority. Avoiding it would give it more importance than it deserved. She opened the envelope. The letter was one page, typed, signed by hand. Claire, it began, which already felt more honest than Dear Claire ever had. I found these when I cleaned out the storage unit. I almost threw them away. Then I realized that would be the last version of the same lie. These were yours as much as mine. Maybe more yours than mine. I do not know how to say that without making it sound like another performance, so I will keep it simple. I was wrong. I let people believe I built everything alone because I liked the way it felt when they admired me. I let lawyers reduce you because it benefited me. I called your caution weakness because I was afraid it was wisdom. You did not take my company. You took back the part of the story I stole. Claire read the final line twice, then placed the letter flat on the table. There was no apology grand enough to restore the years. No sentence could refund humiliation, rebuild trust, or return a woman to herself before the damage. Still, truth had a weight, and for once Ethan had set a piece of it down without demanding credit for carrying it. That mattered, even if it did not change the ending. Later that afternoon, Daniel found her in the archive room on the 39th floor, where rows of bankers' boxes waited under fluorescent lights that made every human being look mildly accused. Claire had spent 2 hours sorting the old documents into piles. Keep, scan, legal, personal. Daniel leaned against the doorway, coffee in hand. Do I want to know? Probably not, Claire said. Wise. Naturally, I am asking anyway. She handed him the Hoboken photo. Daniel studied it. You looked happy. Claire looked at the younger woman in the corner, the one who still believed being useful would make her visible. I was hopeful, she said. There is a difference. Daniel did not answer immediately. That was another reason she trusted him. He knew when silence was not empty. What are you going to do with all this? He asked. Claire glanced at the boxes, the contracts, the first versions of a company history that had once erased her completely. I'm going to document it properly. By Monday, she had instructed legal and communications to revise the official company history before the relaunch. Not as a revenge statement. Not as a public shaming. Just accurately. The founding archive would list Ethan Whitman and Claire Morgan as the original architects of the operating model. Her early contributions would be preserved in the internal record. The training program for new managers would include the case study of Whitman and Company as failure, not to embarrass its former leadership, but to teach the danger of ego dressed as strategy. When Ethan received a copy of the revised archive notice, he did not call. He sent one email with 2 words. Thank you. Claire read it, archived it, and returned to the budget review waiting on her screen. Outside her office, workers were repainting the hallway in a softer gray. The old brass nameplate sat in her drawer, not displayed, not destroyed. Some things did not deserve a stage, but they did deserve a place. By sunset, the city had turned gold against the glass, and Claire watched her reflection appear over the skyline, steady and unmistakably her own. For years, Ethan had made her feel like a footnote in his rise. Now the record had been corrected. Not loudly, not cruelly, permanently. The relaunch was scheduled for the first Monday of March because Daniel insisted that if a company was going to be reborn, it might as well choose a month that at least pretended spring was coming. New York did not cooperate. The morning arrived with a bitter wind cutting through Madison Avenue and a sky the color of unpolished steel, the kind of weather that made every pedestrian look personally betrayed by the atmosphere. Claire arrived at 6:30, carrying her own coffee and a leather folder filled with final remarks she had rewritten 4 times and would probably ignore. The lobby had been transformed over the weekend. The old marble had been cleaned. The lighting was warmer. The reception desk had been moved 10 feet to open the entrance, a small architectural change that somehow made the entire building feel less like a fortress and more like a place where work might actually happen. On the wall, Morgan Crest Holdings reflected softly in brushed silver letters. Beneath it, smaller and temporary, was the phrase strategy with stewardship. Claire had not loved the phrase when communications proposed it. It sounded like something a management consultant might whisper to a houseplant. But it was accurate enough, and accuracy had become her preferred form of beauty. By 8, employees began filling the auditorium again, this time with less suspicion and more restless curiosity. The company had spent the past month doing what struggling companies almost never did well. It had told the truth. Denver was closing in stages. 2 unprofitable service lines were being wound down. 3 client teams were being reorganized. Severance packages were clear, not hidden behind language designed to exhaust people. Health coverage would continue for 90 days for affected employees. Retention bonuses were granted to the operations staff Ethan had once treated like furniture with email addresses. Claire had signed every memo herself. Not because she enjoyed paperwork, only a deeply disturbed species would enjoy that, but because names mattered when decisions touched real lives. Ethan did not attend the relaunch. His advisory period had ended quietly the Friday before. He had come to her office at 4 in the afternoon, returned his badge to Marissa, and asked for 5 minutes. Claire had given him 4. He stood near the door, hands in the pockets of an overcoat that looked more expensive than his confidence. For the first time since she had known him, he seemed unsure what version of himself would be welcomed by the room, and without that certainty, there was not much performance left. "I am leaving New York for a while," he said. "Boston, maybe. A smaller firm offered me a consulting role." Claire nodded. "That sounds sensible." He gave a short laugh, almost embarrassed. "Sensible. I used to hate that word." "I remember." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was simply full of things neither of them could repair. Ethan looked toward the wall where the operating maps had replaced his old magazine covers. "You made it better than I did," he said. Claire did not soften the truth for him. "I made it different." He accepted that with a small nod. Then he left, and the door closed with no final speech, no music, no cinematic mercy. Just the practical click of a latch, which was probably how most eras ended, despite humanity's exhausting need for symbolism. Now, standing backstage at the auditorium, Claire thought of that click as Ruth Callahan stepped beside her with a tablet. "Full house," Ruth said. "Boston and Atlanta are online. Los Angeles is pretending they enjoy being awake this early." Claire smiled. "Brave of them." Ruth glanced at her notes, then at Claire. "You do not look nervous." "I am." "You hide it well." "That is not always a compliment." Ruth absorbed that, because Ruth absorbed everything, then gave a small nod. "Fair." When Claire walked onto the stage, the room quieted without being asked. That was new. Not fear. Attention. She placed her folder on the lectern and looked out at the faces in front of her. People who had spent years surviving the weather of another person's ego. "A company is not saved by a new sign on the wall," she began. "It is saved by what happens after the sign goes up, when the difficult work becomes ordinary and nobody claps for doing it." Her voice did not shake. Somewhere in the second row, Daniel leaned back with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man pleasantly irritated to be impressed. Ruth had been the person Ethan ignored when she told him the original timeline was impossible. They flew to Pittsburgh on a cold Tuesday morning, not by private jet, not with catered bravado, just 2 first-class seats on a commercial flight, because Claire had discovered that money saved from vanity had the strange habit of remaining available for payroll. Ruth carried the revised proposal in a navy folder and said almost nothing during the drive from the airport. Claire could see her rehearsing explanations behind her eyes, preparing to apologize for failures she had warned against. "You do not have to defend the old promise," Claire said as the car crossed the Fort Pitt Bridge, the city opening ahead beneath a pale sky. "It was not yours." Ruth looked out the window. "I signed off on the delivery plan after he changed it. Because he made disagreement dangerous. That does not erase my name from the document." Claire respected that answer. Accountability without self-destruction was a difficult balance, mostly because human beings preferred either denial or a full emotional bonfire. "Then tell them what changed," she said. "Not what you wish had happened." The meeting took place in a modest conference room with beige walls, a long table, and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed by someone angry at beans. Across from them sat 3 hospital executives, including Marianne Wells, the chief operations officer, a woman in her 60s with cropped gray hair and the expression of someone who had survived enough consultants to distrust all nouns ending in solution. Claire liked her immediately. Marianne opened the folder, skimmed the first page, and looked at Ruth. "This timeline says 26 weeks. Ruth straightened. "Yes. Last time, your company promised 12. Last time, our company was wrong." The room went still. Claire kept her face neutral, though something inside her warmed with recognition. There it was. Not polish. Not charm. The truth, standing awkwardly in business attire, hoping not to be escorted out. Ruth continued, her voice steadying as she spoke. She explained the staffing requirements, the integration risks, the testing windows, the cost controls, and every assumption that could affect delivery. She did not blame Ethan. She did not use Claire as a shield. She simply laid out the work as if the people across from her deserved reality more than reassurance. Marianne listened without interruption. When Ruth finished, the chief financial officer asked 2 sharp questions, both fair. Ruth answered both without flinching. Claire spoke only once, near the end, when Marianne asked why Morgan Crest Holdings wanted a second chance. "Because your account should never have been treated as a trophy," Claire said. "It should have been treated as a responsibility. We cannot repair the inconvenience you absorbed last year, but we can give you a proposal we are willing to be judged by." Marianne studied her for a long moment, then closed the folder. "I do not like being sold to, Ms. Morgan." "Neither do I." A flicker of amusement crossed Marianne's face. "That may be the first useful thing anyone from your company has said in this room." They did not win the contract that day. Claire preferred that. Instant trust was usually just impatience wearing a better suit. They left with a request for a revised pricing model and a follow-up technical review, which Ruth treated like a court victory and tried very hard not to show it. On the flight back to LaGuardia, she finally relaxed enough to remove her heels and laugh quietly at herself. "I thought I was going to ruin it," she admitted. "You did the opposite." Ruth looked at Claire across the aisle. "Why did you let me lead?" Claire watched the clouds flatten beneath the wing, white and endless in the late afternoon light. "Because someone should have listened to you the first time." Ruth turned toward the window quickly, but not before Claire saw her eyes shine. Neither of them mentioned it. Some dignity required privacy. When they landed, Claire had 3 missed calls from Daniel and 1 email from Ethan. The subject line was simple, Pittsburgh. For a moment, she wondered how he had heard so quickly. Then she remembered that men who lost rooms often kept listening at the doors. The email contained 1 sentence. "You always knew how to make people trust the work." Claire read it once, then closed it without replying. Not every accurate statement required a relationship. Outside the terminal, the night air smelled of rain, gasoline, and the restless machinery of Queens. Ruth climbed into the waiting car first, already opening her laptop to revise the pricing model. Claire followed, tired but clear-eyed. The company was not healed. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But somewhere between a truthful meeting in Pittsburgh and a quiet ride back through New York traffic, it had taken its first honest breath. April taught Claire that recovery was rarely dramatic. It came in the form of revised contracts, fewer closed-door meetings, engineers who no longer lowered their voices in hallways, and weekly cash reports that looked slightly less like a medical chart for a company on life support. The Pennsylvania hospital network did not sign immediately because Marianne Wells was too sensible to reward one honest meeting with blind faith, a flaw that made her practically endangered in American business. Instead, she sent 13 pages of questions, each one precise enough to make the old Whitman and Company sales team whimper into their branded coffee mugs. Ruth answered every one. Claire reviewed the responses at her kitchen table late on a Sunday night, barefoot, wearing reading glasses she still refused to admit she needed, with the Hudson outside her windows reflecting the city in broken ribbons of light. When she reached the final page, she stopped. Ruth had added a note at the end, not polished, not strategic, just true. "We understand why trust was lost. We will earn it by being measurable, not memorable." Claire read the sentence twice and felt something quiet settle in her chest. That was the company she wanted. Not louder, not flashier, measurable. Useful. Adult, which was apparently a revolutionary concept once people put on expensive suits. The next morning, she sent Ruth a short message. Keep that line. By noon, Mary Ann replied with approval for the technical review. By Thursday, the hospital's information technology team scheduled a site visit in New York. The news moved through Morgan Crest Holdings with the careful optimism of people who had been disappointed too often to clap too soon. Still, the atmosphere changed. Shoulders loosened. Conversations lasted longer near the elevators. Someone in accounting brought in bagels from a shop in Queens and labeled the cinnamon raisin tray for people with questionable judgment, which Claire considered the strongest sign of cultural healing yet. But progress, like every human achievement, attracted spectators who believed they deserved a seat because they once knew the person doing the work. The article appeared on a financial news site the following Friday under a headline that managed to be both lazy and irritating, a rare dual talent. Ethan Whitman's former wife revives his fallen firm. Claire saw it when Marissa placed her phone silently on the desk, expression already apologetic. The piece was not cruel. That almost made it worse. It framed Claire as a surprising figure from Ethan's past, a poised former spouse stepping into the wreckage of his legacy. It mentioned Morgan Crest Holdings in the third paragraph and Claire's restructuring record in the sixth. Ethan's name appeared 7 times before Daniel Mercer was quoted calling the acquisition disciplined. Claire set the phone down carefully, because throwing devices was childish, expensive, and usually bad for insurance premiums. Do you want communications to respond? Marissa asked. Claire looked out at Madison Avenue, where spring sunlight had finally begun lying to everyone about warmth. For years, being misnamed by the world would have hollowed her out. Former wife, former partner, former Mrs. Whitman. The language had always placed her in relation to someone else, as if her life were a hallway connected to his building. Now the old irritation rose, but it did not rule her. It passed through like weather. No, Claire said. Not today. But Daniel had fewer spiritual objections to irritation. He called 10 minutes later. I have seen grocery receipts with better narrative structure, he said. They made you sound like a widow inheriting a lawnmower. Claire almost smiled. That is vivid. It is also insulting. It is predictable. Predictable insults are still insults. She leaned back in her chair. If we correct every bad headline, we become a public relations department with anxiety. A fair description of civilization. The record is being corrected by the work. Daniel was quiet for a moment. That is very noble. Deeply inconvenient, but noble. Claire ended the call with more affection than she would ever confess aloud. That evening, however, the article found Ethan too. He was in Boston by then, living in a furnished apartment near Back Bay, consulting for a firm small enough that no one cared about his old mythology unless he brought it up first. He read the headline 3 times, each reading less comfortable than the last. Former wife. His fallen firm. His legacy. The words should have pleased him in some small, bitter way. They still made him central. But instead, they embarrassed him. Not because the article diminished her, though it did. Because once, he would have let it stand. Once, he would have mistaken that framing for justice. Before midnight, Claire received an email from him with the article forwarded beneath one sentence. They still got the story wrong. She stared at the screen, then typed nothing. The next morning, a correction request was sent to the publication from Ethan's own account, copying Morgan Crest Communications. It stated that Claire Morgan was not merely a former spouse, but an original operational architect of the company's early model, now chief executive officer of the acquiring firm. The correction was issued 2 days later. Small, buried, accurate. Claire did not thank him this time. Accuracy was not a favor. It was a debt finally paid in pennies. But when she walked into the office that Monday and saw Ruth leading the hospital team through the project map with calm authority, Claire understood something that felt almost like mercy. The world might keep trying to make her a character in Ethan's story. That no longer mattered. Inside these walls, in the documents, in the decisions, in the people learning to tell the truth before it became expensive, she was already writing a better one. The corrected article did not become a scandal, because accuracy rarely trends unless it is. Wearing a ridiculous hat, it appeared quietly beneath the original piece in smaller type, the way institutions prefer to admit error without allowing the admission to develop a personality. Claire saw it at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning while standing in the lobby with a paper cup of coffee and a stack of site visit badges for the Pennsylvania hospital team. The correction was brief, almost bloodless. It identified her as an original architect of the company's early operating model and current chief executive officer of Morgan Crest Holdings. No apology, no flourish, just the facts, lined up like furniture finally moved back into the right room. For a moment, she felt nothing. Then, unexpectedly, she felt lighter. Not because a financial news site had granted her permission to exist accurately, but because she had not needed to chase it. The truth had kept walking until the room adjusted around it. By 9, Marianne Wells arrived with 4 members of her technical team, each carrying a laptop bag and the cheerful skepticism of people paid to find problems before customers did. Ruth met them at reception, calm but pale, wearing the same navy blazer she had worn in Pittsburgh, as if clothing could become armor through repetition. Claire watched from near the security desk as Ruth led the group toward the elevators, explaining the day's schedule with a steadiness that would have been impossible 6 weeks earlier. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody corrected her tone. Nobody stepped in to rescue the conversation from competence. Claire followed a few paces behind, listening as Marianne asked about data migration windows, staffing coverage, and escalation protocol. Ruth answered with precision, and when she did not know something, she said so without apology and named who would. Claire nearly smiled. An honest "I do not know," delivered on time, was worth more than 50 confident lies wearing cufflinks. The technical review lasted 6 hours. Engineers presented real constraints. Operations shared the revised rollout map. Finance explained cost buffers without pretending they were decorative. At lunch, instead of taking the hospital team to an expensive restaurant, where people could confuse table linens with trust, Claire had sandwiches brought into the training room and let the technical teams keep talking over diagrams. Marianne noticed. Claire knew she noticed because Marianne had the rare gift of looking unimpressed in a way that suggested approval was being considered but would not be rushed for anyone's comfort. Near 4 o'clock, the hospital team gathered in the largest conference room overlooking Madison Avenue. Spring rain tapped against the windows, soft and steady, turning the city below into a blur of umbrellas and brake lights. Marianne closed her laptop and looked first at Ruth, not Claire. "This is the first time in a year that I believe your company understands the size of the work." Ruth's hands tightened around her pen. "Thank you." "That was not a compliment," Marianne said. "It was a condition." Ruth nodded. "Understood." Then Marianne turned to Claire. "We are prepared to move forward with a limited Phase 1 agreement. 90 days. Clear milestones. Weekly reporting. No marketing announcement until we say there is something worth announcing." Claire felt the room shift, not with excitement exactly, but with restrained relief, which was better. Excitement spent itself too quickly. Relief could become discipline if handled carefully. "That is acceptable," Claire said. "Ruth will remain the executive lead." Ruth turned toward her so quickly that Claire thought she might object out of reflex. She did not. She only swallowed, once, and looked back at Marianne. "I will send the revised implementation calendar by tomorrow at noon Eastern Time." Marianne gave a short nod. "Good." After the hospital team left, the office did not erupt. There were no cheers echoing down the hallway, no childish victory lap around the conference table, no one declaring that everything was fixed because one client had agreed to test whether the company had stopped being foolish. Instead, people returned to their desks and began adjusting the plan. That was how Claire knew the win might hold. The next morning, Daniel appeared in her doorway holding a printed copy of the signed Phase 1 agreement, because he was apparently determined to keep paper alive out of spite. "You realize what this is," he said. Claire did not look up from the vendor cost review. "A limited contract with strict oversight. You are exhausting." "Accurate, though." Daniel placed the agreement on her desk. "It is the first external proof that the market believes this place can function without Ethan." Claire looked at the signature page, at Marianne's name, Ruth's name, her own name beneath Morgan Crest Holdings. "No," she said after a moment. "It is proof that the work can function when the people doing it are allowed to tell the truth." Daniel studied her with that dry, almost paternal irritation he used when proud and unwilling to become sentimental in public. "That is going on a wall somewhere, unfortunately." Claire returned to the spreadsheet. "Put it in the training manual." Walls make people lazy. He laughed and left her office. By evening, the rain had cleared. Claire stayed late, reviewing the final notes from the site visit while the building emptied around her. At 8:40, her phone lit with a message from an unknown Boston number. She knew before opening it. Ethan, I saw the correction. I should have made sure they got it right years ago. Claire read the words in the reflected glow of the office window. Once, a message like that would have pulled her backward for days, into analysis, memory, the old humiliating hope that regret could become repair if she understood it correctly. Now it was just a sentence from a man learning too late that truth charged interest. She typed no response. She set the phone face down and looked out over Manhattan, where lights burned in 1,000 offices full of ambition, fear, and people pretending their calendars were personalities. Somewhere in the city, the first phase of a better company had begun. Somewhere in Boston, Ethan was discovering that remorse did not restore ownership. And on the 47th floor of a building that no longer carried his name, Claire kept working, not because she had anything left to prove to him, but because the future had finally become more interesting than the past. The Phase 1 agreement changed the rhythm of the office. Not what the grand transformation business magazines like to photograph beside glass staircases, but with the uglier, better signs of real work. People stayed late because a deadline mattered, not because Ethan's old culture had treated exhaustion like proof of loyalty. Meetings ended with names attached to decisions. Budgets included buffers instead of fantasies. Ruth Callahan became the person everyone looked to when the hospital project was mentioned, and at first that visibility made her move through the halls like someone carrying a glass bowl filled to the rim. Claire recognized the posture. It was the body's old memory of being punished for competence. So she did what no one had done for her in the early years. She protected Ruth's authority in public and corrected her in private. The difference was not kindness dressed up for a leadership seminar. It was structure. It was decency with a calendar invite. By May, the hospital implementation had completed its first milestone 2 days early, which caused the technical team to react with the cautious joy of people who had seen too many software timelines collapse into interpretive dance. Marianne Wells sent one email, short enough to suggest affection would have embarrassed her. Phase 1 remains credible. Continue. Claire forwarded it to Ruth with no added praise, because Ruth knew exactly what it meant and would not have trusted fireworks anyway. That same afternoon, Morgan Crest Holdings held its first quarterly review under the new leadership. Investors joined by video. Department heads filled the boardroom. Daniel sat near the window with his usual expression of a man morally opposed to enthusiasm. The room looked different now, though the table was the same. No one waited for a performance. No one laughed before knowing whether something was funny. Claire opened with the numbers, clean and unromantic. Revenue was still down year over year. Cash flow had stabilized. Client churn had slowed. The Denver wind down was under budget. The hospital project was on track. There was no miracle, only evidence. For a company recovering from vanity, evidence was practically a religious experience. Halfway through the review, an investor named Graham Ellis asked whether the company planned to restore the Whitman brand in any limited capacity for legacy recognition. The question was polite, polished, and so spectacularly disconnected from reality that Claire almost admired its commitment. Around the table, several people went still. Ruth looked down at her notes. Daniel's eyebrows lifted a fraction of an inch, which for him was basically a parade. Claire folded her hands. No, she said. Graham blinked, waiting for the longer version human beings use when they are afraid of being clear. Claire gave him one. The legacy attached to that name is part of what we are repairing. Recognition without trust is not an asset. It is noise. No one spoke for a moment. Then the chief financial officer moved to the next slide. And just like that, the ghost of the old company lost another room. After the review, Claire returned to her office and found Ruth waiting outside with a folder clutched against her chest. Do you have a minute? Ruth asked. Yes. Inside, Ruth placed the folder on the work table. It contained a proposal for an internal early warning system, a process allowing project teams to flag unrealistic deadlines, resource gaps, and client risks before executives turned them into public promises. Claire read the first 2 pages while Ruth stood stiffly near the chair. This is good, Claire said. Ruth exhaled too quickly, then caught herself. It would have prevented Denver. It will prevent the next Denver. Ruth looked toward the window, where the late May sun lay across Madison Avenue in pale gold bands. I keep thinking about how many people knew and said nothing. Claire closed the folder gently. Most people are not silent because they have nothing to say. They are silent because someone taught them the cost of speaking. Ruth nodded, and for a second the two women shared a kind of understanding that did not need biography. Different lives, same weather. The proposal was approved the following week. It became the Morgan Risk Ledger, an unglamorous name for an unglamorous tool, which meant it had a decent chance of being useful. 3 months earlier, Ethan would have mocked it as bureaucratic caution. 3 months earlier, Claire might have heard his voice in her head when signing it. Now there was only her signature, steady and final. That evening, as she left the building, she passed the lobby wall and paused. Morgan Crest Holdings reflected in the polished stone, quieter than the old brass letters, but stronger somehow because it did not appear to be begging for admiration. Outside, Manhattan was loud, impatient, convinced as always that urgency was the same thing as purpose. Claire stepped onto the sidewalk and felt her phone vibrate once. An email from Daniel. Subject line, quarterly review. The message contained 4 words. Not terrible. Keep going. Claire smiled despite herself and slipped the phone into her coat pocket. Once, she had built in the shadows and watched another person stand in the light. Now she understood something simple enough to sound obvious and hard enough to take years to learn. Visibility was not the same as being seen. Ownership was not the same as control. And power, real power, was not making a room fear your absence. It was building something that could tell the truth after you left. June arrived with the kind of bright, careless weather that made Manhattan look briefly innocent, a trick the city performed just often enough to keep rent prices morally indefensible. By then, the hospital project had completed its second milestone. The Morgan Risk Ledger had caught 3 schedule problems before they became client apologies, and Ruth Callahan had stopped entering Claire's office as if she were asking permission to breathe. The company was still fragile, but it was no longer pretending fragility was the same thing as vision. On the first Friday of the month, Claire stood in the auditorium again, this time not for a relaunch, not for investors, not for crisis management, but for the first internal leadership forum Morgan Crest Holdings had ever held. The room was filled with managers from New York, Boston, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, people who had flown in with garment bags, laptops, and the nervous suspicion that the word leadership usually meant someone was about to make them clap for a slide deck. Claire had banned slogans from the event, which made communications suffer quietly in a corner, as communications departments have suffered since the dawn of laminated name badges. Instead, she began with a plain sentence. A company becomes dangerous when people are rewarded for sounding certain and punished for being accurate. No one moved for a moment. Then pens began to write. She spoke for 20 minutes about what had happened, not the gossip version, not the softened version, and not the version that made her a saint or Ethan a monster. She described overexpansion, delayed warnings, executive vanity, ignored operators, and the cost of a culture where truth had needed permission. She did not mention the marriage. She did not need to. The lesson was larger than the 2 people who had first broken it open. Near the end, she looked toward the middle rows, where Ruth sat beside the hospital project team. The future of this company will not be protected by one person at the top, Claire said. It will be protected by systems that make honesty easier than silence. The applause that followed was steady, not explosive. Claire preferred it that way. Explosions were usually expensive. After the forum, Daniel found her in the back hallway, where she was drinking water from a paper cup and enjoying the rare luxury of nobody needing her for at least 40 seconds. You have become annoyingly good at this, he said. Public speaking? No. Building without needing mythology. Claire glanced through the open auditorium doors, where managers had gathered in clusters instead of fleeing to check email, which suggested civilization might still have 2 or 3 redeeming qualities left. Mythology is easier, she said. That is why people keep choosing it. Daniel nodded. Ethan sent me a note. Claire looked at him. Why? He asked whether I thought you would take his call. The old version of her would have felt her body tighten around that question, as if a single call could drag her backward through every room where she had once disappeared beside him. This version only felt tired, and then clear. No, she said. Daniel did not push. I told him I would ask. Now you have. That evening, when When the building had emptied and the summer lights stretched gold across the 47th floor, Claire found Ethan's last email waiting in her inbox. No subject, just a few lines. I understand why you will not speak with me. I am sorry I learned too late that being admired is not the same as being worthy of admiration. I hope you build something better than what I broke. Claire read it once. Then she sat very still, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant horns below, the soft electrical pulse of a company still awake around her. There had been a time when she would have wanted those words so badly she might have mistaken them for healing. Now they felt like a receipt from a store that had closed years ago, proof that something had been paid, but not something she needed to carry in her purse. She archived the email. Not deleted, not answered. Archived. Some histories deserved storage, not oxygen. Before leaving, she opened the top drawer of her desk and took out the old brass nameplate Ethan had returned. Ethan Whitman, founder. The metal felt heavier than it should have. She carried it down to the archive room herself, placed it in the properly labeled box beside the early operating plans and the corrected founding record, and closed the lid. There was no ceremony. There did not need to be. When she stepped outside onto Madison Avenue, the evening air was warm, and the city smelled of rain on concrete, food carts, and June impatience. Claire paused beneath the silver sign in the lobby, then walked through the revolving doors without looking back. The company behind her was not perfect. It would make mistakes. It would need discipline, humility, and probably more meetings than any merciful universe should allow. But it was no longer built on her silence. It was no longer decorated with someone else's version of her life. And somewhere between the first signature and this quiet summer evening, Claire had finally understood that the best revenge was not taking back what he had lost. It was becoming the kind of woman who could own it, improve it, and still walk away free. By July, the company had stopped feeling like a building under renovation and started feeling like a place with a pulse. Not a loud pulse, not the kind consultants tried to sell with stock photos of diverse people pointing at glass walls, but a real one. Steady, imperfect, alive. The hospital project entered its final phase ahead of schedule, and Marianne Wells sent her first email containing the word pleased, which Ruth printed and taped inside her notebook like a religious relic. Claire pretended not to notice, because leadership sometimes meant allowing people their private little victories without turning them into motivational posters, humanity's most reliable crime against sincerity. The Denver closure finished under budget, with every affected employee receiving the full transition package Claire had promised. 2 senior engineers from that office accepted remote roles. One operations coordinator used the severance and placement support to join a nonprofit health technology group in Colorado Springs, then sent Claire a handwritten card saying she had expected to be discarded and had instead been treated like a person. Claire kept the card in her drawer beside Ethan's old brass nameplate, not because the two belonged together, but because contrast was sometimes the cleanest form of memory. One object represented the story that had erased her. The other represented the kind of power she wanted never to forget. On the second Thursday of the month, Morgan Crest Holdings hosted its first client advisory dinner at a quiet restaurant near Bryant Park. There were no photographers, no ice sculptures, no donor wall nonsense dressed up as humility. Just 12 clients. For senior staff members, Daniel, Ruth, and Claire at a long table beneath warm lamps, while rain tapped softly against the windows. The conversation moved from implementation risk to staffing shortages to the strange American habit of making every software platform promise transformation when most companies would benefit from a calendar that worked and managers who answered email. Marianne sat across from Claire, sipping black coffee after dessert, which Claire regarded as either discipline or a cry for help. Your team did what they said they would do, Marianne said. That should not feel unusual, Claire replied. It does. Then the market is in worse shape than I thought. Marianne's mouth tilted. It is. But you already knew that. At the other end of the table, Ruth was explaining the risk ledger to a manufacturing executive who looked skeptical in the healthy way. Daniel leaned toward Claire. She is good. She was always good, Claire said. The room changed. Daniel looked at her then, and for once he did not make a joke. So did you. Claire did not answer immediately. Outside, headlights moved across wet pavement in long yellow strokes. For years, change had sounded to her like survival, like rebuilding, like proving something to people who had already decided not to see her. Now it sounded quieter. It sounded like choosing what stayed and what no longer deserved entry. After dinner, she walked back toward Madison Avenue instead of taking the car waiting at the curb. The rain had faded into mist, and Midtown glowed with that particular summer night arrogance New York wore so well, as if the city had personally invented ambition and expected applause for the inconvenience. Claire carried her coat over one arm and let the damp air touch her face. Near the corner of Fifth Avenue, her phone buzzed. It was a message from an unfamiliar number, though she knew who it was before reading it. Ethan had sent a photograph. For a moment she considered deleting it unopened. Then she tapped the screen. The image showed a small conference room in Boston, plain walls, cheap chairs, a whiteboard covered in notes. On the table sat a printed worksheet titled Operating Risk Review. Beneath the photo, Ethan had written, "I used your system today. It worked." No apology followed. No request. No attempt to reopen a door she had closed. Just a fact, awkward and small. Claire stood beneath the green glow of a traffic light and felt an emotion she could not name at first. Not tenderness, not satisfaction. Something more mature and less entertaining, which meant humans had probably failed to market it properly. It was the recognition that even broken stories could stop spreading damage if someone finally learned from the fracture. She typed no reply. The light changed. Pedestrians surged around her, each one carrying a private emergency, a dinner reservation, a heartbreak, a grocery list, or some other proof that civilization continued through sheer stubborn logistics. Claire slipped the phone back into her bag and crossed the street. By the time she reached the lobby, the silver letters of Morgan Crest Holdings were glowing against the stone wall. She paused there, as she sometimes did, not to admire the name, but to measure whether it still felt honest. It did. Upstairs, a few office lights remained on. Ruth's team was probably still revising tomorrow's presentation, because competence, left unsupervised, had its own form of madness. Claire smiled faintly and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed on her reflection, and for the first time in years, she did not see the woman Ethan had underestimated, or the woman the press had misnamed, or the woman who had bought back a stolen piece of her story. She saw the woman who had stayed long enough to rebuild it correctly.